Hello, and welcome to this Economist Impact Insight Hour entitled Reshaping the Plastics Industry, Resilience, Circularity, and Climate Neutrality, sponsored by Plastics Europe. My name is Jonathan Birdwell, and I am Regional Head of Policy and Insights at Economist Impact for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So just to set the scene before I introduce our speakers, according to the OECD in 2018, globally between 14 and 18% of plastic was recycled, and about a third of plastic ends up in the environment, much of it in our oceans. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, if we were to continue on this current track, the volume of annual plastic entering the ocean could almost triple by 2040. And so, faced with this challenge, it is now widely accepted that we need to move to a circular economy where we eliminate the plastic packaging that we don't need and boost our ability to reuse and recycle plastic in general. So consequently, the plastics industry is under pressure to take far-ranging reorganization of their production and technology base, looking at alternative raw materials and energy sources, innovation, new technologies, and investments. The industry is exploring everything from feedstock generated from advanced recycling technologies, renewable and low carbon energy sources, and producing more plastics from organic feedstock and CO2. But how is this transition going? Is it moving quickly enough? Amidst general concerns about greenwashing, it is important that we look closely at what the industry is doing and to assess if they're going far and fast enough. But of course, it's also vital that we recognize the importance of the industry and consider how its resilience can be secured without compromising sustainability, particularly at this such a difficult time economically. So with me today to discuss these topics, I'm very pleased to be joined by a fantastic group of speakers. Dr. Linnea Peterson, Manager of Sustainable Materials Strategy for Volvo Cars. Rob Ingram, Steering Board Member, Plastics Europe, and CEO of Ineos Olefins and Polymers Europe. Stefano Soro, Head of the Green and Circular Economy Unit at Department of Growth, DG GROW, European Commission. And George Barrett, Sustainability Manager for Circular Economy at John Lewis Partnership. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us. So I want to come to you first, Linnea, and I wonder if you could say just a little bit about how you manage and monitor plastic production and consumption in your supply chain at Volvo Cars.
Well, we have worked with plastics and sustainable plastics for quite some time, and we have specific targets on each vehicle program on how to incorporate sort of more recycled and bio-based polymers, and also pinpointing specific components where we want to introduce sort of the new, more advanced recycling, such as chemical recycling or polymers from greenhouse gases. We're also very much working with our supply chain, so the type of packaging that comes with our supply chain, and which materials can be reused, and where can we find different interesting loops where we can sort of utilize those materials both in our vehicles and to other applications surrounding our vehicles.
Excellent. And George, I want to come to you. So same question, John Lewis Partnership, very extensive supply chains there. How are you managing the sort of monitoring reduction of production of plastic and consumption of plastic in your supply chains?
Yeah, it's a great question. One we've been looking at for some time as well, Jonathan. And similar and akin to what Linnea said, we have an existing suite of targets that we expect our suppliers, both at John Lewis and Waitrose, to adhere to, and our teams work closely with our suppliers to make sure we're reducing where possible, but also moving our packaging towards the most recyclable materials we can. And then on top of that, we work closely with, I suppose, our customer marketing teams and our transformation teams to look at what are the strategic projects that we need to focus on to drive, to Linnea's point, that transition towards reusable packaging, refillable packaging.
Do you have an example of like some of those strategic projects?
Yeah, so in 2018, for example, we launched our Waitrose Unpacked project in a number of stores, which was at the time one of the larger, I suppose, refillable models, trying to bring refillable packaging to the mass market in the UK. And what's been really positive now is that we're seeing a broader industry shift. So we're now part of something called the Refill Coalition, along with some of our industry peers, where we realise to actually drive the level of change required at the pace needed, we're going to have to do this together. So we're in that coalition with the likes of Marks and Spencer's, Ocado, and a few others.
Great. And Rob, let me come to you. Plastics Europe, trade association body for plastic manufacturers. Obviously the industry as a whole is in the midst of a big transition, and I know we'll get into more of the detail, but can you kind of set out what the sort of main priorities are within the plastics industry from your perspective?
Yes, of course, and you're very right in describing this as a massive transition for the industry. There are, I guess, three key focuses for the industry as we progress through this challenge. Firstly, and in no particular order, not priority order, but firstly, to ensure that we can address the challenge of reduction of emissions. Principally, the sort of headline is CO2 emissions. This applies across our full manufacturing capability is to be as emission free as possible. We need to work across the value chain to increase circularity. So to ensure that the materials that are put into the market by the industry and by our industry partners can be readily recovered and recycled through a range of different technology processes. And the third is to ensure that we have products that are fit for purpose to ensure that we can continue to support the transition that society needs, putting on available materials that allow the performance to be maintained and the applications to be delivered, which allow society to make all of the changes that we all as individuals need to see happen. And
just to stay with you, Rob, for a second, in terms of the sort of general economic context, right? What is that doing to the plastics industry? What sort of pressures is that putting on the plastics industry at this point in time?
So clearly, I mean, we're not isolated in the plastics industry as experiencing challenges from the wider economic environment that we see, particularly in Europe. But I think as an energy-intensive industry, we're perhaps a little bit more acutely felt than some other sectors. And what we see through our discussions with our customers and down the value chain is that certainly the pressures from the very high and highly volatile energy prices that we've seen in recent months and expect to see continuing certainly for the near future, does put additional pressure inevitably on the whole value chain. I think what's important in that environment is that we collectively don't lose sight of the need to continue to drive forward on our sustainability goals and the need to rapidly improve and increase the amount of circularity in our businesses. But I think there is perhaps a little bit of an overlay in the short term as we see through our customers and through the value chain that maybe the pace of adoption of some of those measures are taking somewhat of a side seat against managing the immediate issues of competitiveness in such an environment. That having been said, I genuinely feel that the industry is not losing any of its commitment to drive forward on these changes. But it is inevitable that there are other factors at play in the immediate short term.
Stefano, I'm going to come to you, sort of policymaker, get your policymaker perspective here, and in the same way, sort of set out what are the policy priorities for you in the European Commission in terms of enabling this transformation within the plastics industry and the circular economy more widely. And then we can deep dive into some of those areas. But first, good to get that kind of set out, the general picture.
Yeah, well, the general picture, I mean, my intervention here has been made much easier by what Rob just said. The objective is to have a policy and regulatory framework which enables the achievement of the three objectives that it was mentioned, with the added complication of the volatile environment of the last 12, 18 months. I have to say that the volatility is a black cloud, has a silver lining in terms of circularity, because it's highlighted the importance not only of the economic, of the environmental and climate sustainability of circularity, but also of the economic and financial sustainability, because the prices of inputs, of material inputs, have gone through the roof because of supply issues. So we want to have in place, and we have been working, starting with the plastic strategy of 2018, on delivering, as I was saying, a regulatory and policy framework that allows reduction, reuse, recycling, circularity, while at the same time enables the European plastics industry to thrive, and allows it to give us the product that we need.
Excellent. And so Rob, I want to come back to you. The heart of the issue, it seems, is that plastic is sourced from hydrocarbons. Part of it, going to your point about sort of reuse and recycle plastics and how it's comprised. And so, is it possible for plastics to be sustainable when they are made from hydrocarbons? Is it possible to move away from that, for example, with bioplastics, using more recycled plastic polymers? What's the sort of state of materials and technologies that can deliver these types of plastics, this kind of shift?
That was me, or was it for Rob?
It was originally for Rob, but please, we can.
Okay. No, that's what I was saying. That's a question you should ask the industry first. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Rob, then you first, and then
let me pick up the baton, then Stefano, and you can follow on.
Brilliant.
So I guess I would start by saying there is no silver bullet answer to this. There's no one solution that will enable the industry to make a transition to a fully sustainable, fully circular, net zero emission future. The journey, and it is a transition, is going to involve many different contributing factors, whether that's increased use of bio materials as feedstocks, especially looking at the impact of the use of increased circularity, use of technologies that exist today, exploiting best-in-class technologies that we have available to us today, but also developing new technologies that are somewhat nascent and not at full scale. We're going to have to, as an industry and as a society, look across a whole range of different activities to enable us to reach our goals. There isn't one solution. Plastics Europe, in fact, has recently commissioned a report that was published by Systemic called Reshaping Plastics. I would encourage you to, if you have the chance, to have a look at some of the findings of that independent report. And what it has done is looked at pathways towards a sustainable, climate neutral plastics industry in Europe. And its conclusions are very much as I have sort of outlined, that it will require a combination of factors, but it highlights the overweighting in terms of the importance of circularity. So I think that is really going to be the key to allowing us to deliver the aims that we are looking for as a society and as an industry. I see Linnea raised a hand there. Jonathan.
Oh, Linnea, please jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, what Rob says, it is not one solution fits all. And I think that's why it takes time to do that transformation within the industry. I mean, looking at a car with, the tons of components that we have, it would be individual solutions for the different plastic in each component. I mean, sometimes there's a bio-based polymer that can be used. Sometimes it's a mechanical recycled. And of course, if we want to create closed loops with our own materials, sort of from the end of life vehicles, we might have to go for chemical recycling, because polymers in the vehicles are used for such a long time that there's a high chance that we have degradation of those materials. So, and that's why sort of all the companies will be on a journey to try to find their individual solutions.
Jonathan, if I may come in again.
Please.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of build on Linnea's comment there and elaborate a little bit more from my sort of earlier input. Is that because there is a need for, say, all levers to be pulled to enable us to successfully achieve this transition, and it is a transition. It's going to be many steps over a period of time. I think it's important, and this is somewhat maybe a sort of a comment directed a little bit towards Stefano, is that we have a regulatory framework that is somewhat technology neutral and material neutral, to ensure that we can incorporate all options that allow us to make the steps required, and also takes into consideration that our ability to affect those changes, our ability to develop technologies and to innovate will evolve over time. And things that maybe we can't do particularly well now, we'll get better at doing in the future. I mean, that is effectively what our industry does, is we take technologies, we take innovation, we take technologies, we scale them up, we improve them, we optimize them, and that's what makes them sustainable for the long term. And we need to be able to have a regulatory environment, I think, that enables industry to explore, develop, and assess all options, so that we can find collectively the most effective and the most optimal solutions for the future, and not inadvertently close off avenues today, which might actually be a very fruitful pathway towards enabling us to make some of these changes in the future.
So, Stefano, I want to come to you, but first, just to build on what Rob was saying, we have a question from the audience, which was that I think is similar to what Rob was saying. How are innovations in plastic and other materials addressing regulations on waste and plastic? For example, the Single-Use Plastics Directive or the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. Stefano?
As Rob said, it's a transition process which is going to take time. I mean, in fact, in terms of emission reduction and circularity, the European Union has a climate law which sets mandatory targets with two stepping stones. One is in 2030, and then in 2050, carbon neutrality. And innovation, as mentioned by Rob, is paramount in achieving these objectives. So yes, I agree, should be technology neutral, focusing on outcomes. In particular, in recycling, because there is a bit of a crunch on feedstock for the production of products. So there is a space to have more products made with recycled plastics. We need innovation in recyclability. We need innovation in sorting and recycling processes. We need innovation in recycling techniques. If you were meaning chemical recycling, that is part of the picture going forward. Probably we'll have to see how that develops. Then, there are some sort of enabling things that we can do. We have seen, for instance, that mandatory recycled content is a powerful signal for market and investors. We've seen it with the Single-Use Plastics Directive. The Commission, in its Circular Economy Action Plan of 2020, has announced mandatory recycled content in sectors like packaging, vehicles, hello Linnea, and construction. We are preparing regulatory proposals as we speak. At the same time, given the volatility of the environment, we are embarking in an unprecedented effort to make sure that European consumer, and in particular industrial consumers, continue to have access to affordable or as affordable as possible energy sources. So it's a turbulent framework. It's a turbulent framework where we try to make sure that these objectives are achieved despite the turbulence.
And George, maybe I want to come to you, from the kind of consumer side. How are these directives sort of shaping what you do at John Lewis Partnerships? How important are they to you? Do you try and go further than them? What would you like to see coming down the pipeline in the strategy?
Yeah, it's something we take incredibly seriously at the partnership. This morning I was actually writing a paper for our executive team on this very topic. So in the UK, there's a strong commitment from the UK government to transition from the packaging waste regulations or the producer responsibility requirements to extended producer responsibility requirements, which is going to push retailers and producers to go further than ever to look to reduce their packaging footprints, both in terms of the weight of packaging we place on the market and the total amount of units. I think what's clever is that within that there's a modulated fee structure. So the better, more recycled or the better packaging you place on the market with a higher recycled content value will receive a lower cost of that legislation. So it's really going to incentivize big business to move in a direction where we're accelerating our plans and trying to look strategically across both our supply chains but also our store estate. I think, to go back to one of Rob's earlier points though, these costs are significant, which, they're in the tens of millions, which is we've got to cover the full net cost of recovery to support municipal recycling. But there are plenty of known unknowns with this. It's not a light switch. We're not going to be able to suddenly remove single-use plastic tomorrow. There are huge amounts of almost entrenched customer behaviours, but also employee behaviours as well, that we're really going to have to move. And sometimes these are high capital expenditure projects that we're going to have to almost quite boldly launch and then hopefully nudge consumers along. And we've seen that with carrier bags, we've seen that with cigarettes in the past, but it's definitely a challenging transition, as Rob mentioned.
And the sort of policy framework is you think important to sort of incentivize or to push companies to take the plunge and basically make these investments?
Yeah, absolutely. The policy framework is one key driver. We've seen the Scottish government and the UK government commit to introducing deposit return schemes, as we've seen in Europe, Canada, and other countries as well. But we have to get that policy framework set up in the right way, so that it incentivizes the right behavior from business. Otherwise, we're going to see adverse reactions and adverse impacts. So, for example, you'll see people significantly switching to paper, but it may not be the best material in all cases. There's plenty of forests now being chopped down in Cumbria and Ireland because of that huge increase in paper consumption. So we have to make sure that policy framework is correct. But equally, we're not seeing customer demand wane here at all. We're seeing this still being a huge driver of brand equity, brand impressions, still a hugely significant pressure from NGOs as well. So the policy framework is one driver, but there are huge and multiple drivers alongside.
And Linnea, I want to come to you, and it'd be great to hear your perspective. How is Volvo balancing priorities around, for example, improving fuel efficiency by using lightweight materials from plastic with the need to reduce use of plastic, or at least virgin plastic? Is there a demand for recycled plastics? And then a sort of larger question, what should users of plastic materials, whether that's John Lewis Partnership, consumer good companies, or automotive firms, should you be demanding from the plastics industry or requiring from the plastics industry?
When it comes to our sort of requirements, we've had requirements on recycled and bio-based plastics in our vehicles from 2018. So we've been very early with setting these type of targets. And for us, we're looking at the materials on the component level from an entire life cycle. So taking into consideration the weight and how that will impact the use phase emissions. Even though from 2030 we will only produce electric vehicles, we know that the electricity has a footprint, so we need to keep that down. So you just need to have take an entire perspective of your components and your sort of products when you take this into consideration. But when we look at a life cycle analysis of a vehicle, plastic stands for less than 10% of the footprint. If you look at sort of the materials in the vehicle, it is the metals that take a majority of the parts, so such as aluminium and steel, due to the high weight of those material groups, and also for aluminium, the high footprint. So what we're starting to do is we're starting from the polymers that have a very high carbon footprint, such as polyamide, PC, PCABS, to make sure that they have a bio-based or recycled content in order to bring those sort of carbon footprints down. But when it comes to asking, I mean, we have lots of engagement with the polymer industry to make sure that we can find the type of grades that we are interested in. And I feel that we get a very nice response. I mean, the polymer industry is very much on board and wanting to try to find more sustainable solutions. So there, I think it's mainly the price. I mean, you have different options available. It's, what are they allowed to cost in the vehicle? And in order to sort of battle that, we've now put a price on CO2. So we've put a carbon price that's going to help to steer sort of the material selection and technologies in the right direction. So more sustainable solutions that will reduce our carbon footprint are allowed to cost more, because we know that we have a climate neutrality target for 2040, and the CO2 that we're not allowed to or not able to take away, we need to compensate, and that's going to be expensive. So it's better to pay that price now with more sustainable solutions than having to pay the price at the end to do the offsetting.
That kind of reminded me of an audience question that maybe I'll come to you, Rob, or Stefano. This member of the audience asked, what advancements do you think would be needed for direct air capture to become an industrially relevant source of carbon for plastics? Rob?
I won't profess to being an expert on direct air capture, so I would take anything I say with a healthy pinch of salt in this regard. But I think perhaps with a number of these energy transition technologies, a key enabler is the availability of green energy to power the processes in the first instance. So I would perhaps be able to maybe make some comments from that perspective, because I'm not expert enough on DAC to say much about the process within that box. But with regard to any evolution of new processes or electrification of existing processes, the benefits are really manifest when the energy input is renewable, and or any emissions associated with that technology can be captured, mitigated, reused, stored. So on DAC, clearly your emissions are probably less of your issue, because what we're actually you're talking about there is a technology that effectively draws CO2 out of the atmosphere to create a source of carbon for synthesis of chemical materials in the chemical industry. So the output is somewhat understood. The input, I would imagine there's a degree of energy required to run that process. You need to make sure that the energy input footprint doesn't offset the output benefits, and clearly a way of ensuring that is the case is renewable power. And that is true of a lot of energy process changes that we might be looking at. There's a significant need for additional renewable power and renewable power infrastructure that is required not just by our industry, but by society as a whole. In terms of an enabler, that is a key enabler to a lot of the transition benefits that I think we're looking to capture as a society.
And maybe on that point, Stefano, if you could come in there, I don't know if this is within your sort of strategy specifically, but what is the sort of the wider commission targets around just general renewable energy sources across Europe?
Yeah, I mean, as Rob was saying, I'm not an expert as well in this particular technology, but 2 points I would like to make here. One, the fact that this sort of innovation is popping up is extremely important. It's probably testimony to the importance of making the industry sustainable. It needs two things: capital and affordable, accessible, available, abundant decarbonized energy. And this is what we are working towards. We have a raft of initiatives. Some luckily started before Mr. Putin's aggression on the Ukraine, not luckily, because of our climate objectives. We are in out policy and regulatory initiatives that are designed to facilitate the transition towards electrification of industry and electrification with decarbonized sources of energy. A few examples: we have just proposed a regulation to make permitting of renewable installations much faster and much easier. And if you talk to the renewables industry, in particular the renewables equipment industry, and you tell them, I'm your Aladdin's lamp genius and I have one wish that I grant you, they don't ask for state aid as much as they ask for agile, predictable, fast permitting procedures. We are launching next week, the week after next, a new industrial alliance on solar photovoltaics, which is modeled on the Batteries Alliance. 5 years ago in the European Union, there was virtually no production of large batteries. Now, with the Batteries Alliance, and with the public and private investment that it's mobilized, we are on course to be 70% independent in production by 2025, which is tomorrow morning, and 90% by 2030. So we are working both on regulation, but also on non-regulatory policy incentives and financial incentives to make sure that this transition happens. Then, there are things that happen like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a bit of elephant in any renewables room these days, approved by the US Congress on the initiative of President Biden, which is just a massive state aid scheme in particular on clean tech. That is a bit of a conundrum for us because there's a torrent of money being poured in state aid, and we all know what unchecked state aid can do at a global level. But it's also an important signal of the fact that at global level, in developed economies and beyond, the transition, the green transition of the energy systems and of the industrial systems is considered as a fact and not as an aspiration.
Jonathan, may I pick up on a couple of points that Stefano made there, because I think they're quite important. As Stefano mentioned, innovation with regard to the sort of direct carbon capture technology, and I think that's a very interesting perspective for us to take on from a European standpoint. Is that with some regards, Europe is not best placed in terms of its competitive position, particularly in the petrochemicals industry and the plastics industry, compared to other regions of the globe, in terms of a competitive standpoint. But through this transition, Europe has the potential to be a real global leader and a crucible for developing and deploying innovative technologies and techniques. What will enable us as an industry to be able to take that leading position and establish Europe at the forefront and the cutting edge relates to a couple of other points that Stefano made around permitting and regulation. We need a regulatory and permitting environment that allows us to be able to invest in a timely manner so that we can develop these technologies and stay at the forefront in comparison to maybe some other regions where those processes can maybe move at a slightly more rapid pace, which would give other regions the opportunity to steal a march on innovation. And the US is a very useful example in that context. The new measures that are being announced by the Biden administration put a lot of ability and flexibility for the US industry to make these types of innovative investments. We need to make sure that Europe isn't disadvantaged against that kind of competitive backdrop.
And what kind of technologies in particular do you think like Europe can become a kind of strategic leader on? Is it advanced chemical recycling technologies? Maybe a few examples.
Yeah, as an example, that's a good case in point. So advanced chemical recycling. So this was taking end-of-life waste plastics back through to the state of a feedstock that can be fed into the initial production process to make the building blocks for polymers. Now, I think the industry sees a very significant opportunity for chemical recycling to contribute to the circular economy and the sustainable goals, but absolutely as a complement to mechanical recycling. So mechanical recycling is taking plastic waste at the end of life and turning it back into plastic, whereas chemical recycling takes it back to a feedstock, which is then made into a plastic. So mechanical recycling is absolutely would be your priority to start as a route to recycling end of life waste plastic. But mechanical recycling today has certain limitations. There are only certain materials that are effectively mechanically recycled, and there are only certain applications that can effectively be serviced with mechanically recycled materials. So we're in the mechanical recycling box. We've already got some constraints. We need to be able to maximize the materials that go into mechanical recycling and expand the applications that can be serviced by that. But there's still going to be a constraint. Where chemical recycling fits in is mopping up all the rest. So taking the other material, the waste plastic materials that can't be mechanically recycled, and it also enables recycled plastic to reach all applications that materials are supplied to today, including medical applications, food contact applications, as an example. Now that technology is developing. I would say it's not quite at full industrial scale yet. Number of industry players are investing quite significantly in this area. If I can use an example that I know fairly well, because it's within my own business, we've recently announced the intention to develop a 100,000 ton unit in association with a technology provider called Plastic Energy to provide feedstocks for one of our facilities in Germany based from waste plastic. But that's still a technology that needs to be scaled up significantly across the industry to deliver what the market demands and what regulation is driving us towards. Other technologies, for instance, that need development, which also need infrastructure to support it, might be hydrogen, and the use of hydrogen as again, it's not the answer, but it's certainly part of the answer. Is the use of hydrogen as a way to help us decarbonize fuel sources, both in our production facilities, but also more widely in society, in transportation or a number of other areas also. So I think, just as two examples, there are areas where the know-how exists in Europe, the desire to invest and implement and develop these technologies exists in Europe. And we need to make sure that there is a framework with the help of Stefano and his team that enables us to do that in a timely manner and keep us ahead of the game in Europe, rather than a follower with other regions taking the lead.
Great, thanks, Rob. And Stefano, I saw your hand, but I'm going to come to George first, and then back to you, Stefano. So George, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. It's just to build on Rob's point there around it. It's really positive in Europe and the UK. We're seeing a real growth of some of this recycling infrastructure and some real investment from governments. I think one of the real needs for this is to ensure that there's accessibility and availability of that infrastructure. And the reason I say that is, and it goes back to the earlier point I made around adverse impacts, if we don't ensure these post-consumer, I suppose, secondary raw material feedstocks are going to the right places, we risk waste exports overseas, often to developing markets. So, for example, we've committed to launching a soft plastics, flexible plastics recycling scheme in our stores, but we've deliberately gone quite slowly to ensure we've got that full traceability, full chain of custody, that when we launch it next year, in the significant majority of our Waitrose stores, that there is a full UK-based closed-loop recycling scheme for that, rather than risking that going overseas and ending up on riverbanks, as we've seen. But I think to also build on Rob's point, we're talking about plastics having a role here, and there is a real distinction between good plastics and bad plastics. And Rob's point about hydrogen is absolutely valid, because plastics is going to enable the net zero transition. If you look at photovoltaics, you look at subsea cables to offshore wind farms, you look at the impact of food waste in our world. Plastics plays a role in mitigating food waste and ensuring food can go cleanly, safely, securely to our customers. And therefore, this is about ensuring we have a circular supply of good plastics, and collectively as an industry, we try to eliminate these bad plastics.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, link with what Rob was saying, and also George. One of the factors that makes us not as competitive as we would like to be is that we are one of the regions in the world, if not the region in the world, where the price of energy inputs is the highest. So, I mean, technologies like, this plastic-specific technologies, Rob gave a good example about, hydrogen and electrolyzers, batteries, where we went from zero to nearly hero in a few years. Now we're investing in trying to revamp the solar PV industry in Europe. We are trying to keep the wind industry, where Europe is still leader, despite the difficulties, a leader, because demand is increasing and will be increasing. And then, there are other technologies like heat pumps. And we're not talking about the heat pump that you have in your apartment. We're talking large heat pumps that are used in industrial applications as well. And this is all part of our absolute priorities in terms of support, in terms of policy action, and in terms of regulatory action, to accelerate and scale up the transition and make Europe competitive. Plastics industry is a chemical industry, which is an energy intensive industry. So it's absolutely crucial for our competitiveness here to have abundant decarbonized electricity available for the industry to transition.
So we only have a few minutes left. So I wanted to bring in, kind of going on George's point, a few questions from the audience, especially as COP coming to an end, with its focus on developing countries. Two audience questions. Should the plastic industry invest in infrastructure, collection, sorting, processing in developing countries? And the second related is, given the amount of plastics that are dumped in developing nations that go to landfill or enter in water sources, what methods of recapturing and recycling plastics from these sources are being developed? George, you already mentioned one example of a scheme, and actually the priority to make sure that it's a closed loop in the UK. I don't know, do others in the panel have any thoughts or comments on that point? Linnea?
Yeah, I mean, our cars are rarely just dumped, but they are exported to other countries. And that, of course, we are starting to sort of worry about what happens when the materials are exported. And we would like to get, the plastics back from our vehicles so that we can have the closed loop. But I don't think that our product is as exposed as, waste exporting or other products being exported. So in that case, it's a little bit easier for us. But with regards to, using ocean plastics, I think all companies are trying to find, components where we can actually use those type of plastics to be able to create a market for it so that the materials are being picked up and are being used. And of course, it's always the sort of the difficulty with the high demands that the automotive industry have on the different plastics. So mainly those would end up in different interior details, but that can also highlight the problem and making our customers aware of the plastic problem, I would say.
And maybe, I don't know, Stefano, Rob, is the focus to ensure that closed loop within Europe, within the UK or countries within Europe? And what about that sort of investment versus investing in support to developing countries to prevent waste from reaching their shores? Stefano?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, there is no number should invest in collection, sorting, and processing of plastic waste for sure. I mean, even in Europe, we're still under our objectives. So I hope, for instance, that the new UN Treaty on Plastic Pollution will drive some global efforts to appreciate the magnitude of the investments needed, which is humongous, and explore financing solutions, especially for developing countries. Plastic pollution, plastic consumption, and hence pollution will probably increase with increase in the standards of living. But without investment in infrastructure, pollution will increase, and this is not acceptable. So yes, there should be some global effort, and maybe industry, and for sure industry can play a part in this.
Yeah, Rob?
Yeah, I totally support the comments there from Stefano. Inevitably, across the world, we need better infrastructure to collect and waste plastics, waste materials of any nature, and ensure they have an extended life and an end of use, another use after their first primary purpose. And perhaps in the medium to long term, the most effective way of doing that is to ensure that these materials have a value. And the way those materials can have a value is that we have technologies that can convert them into products that can access value-added applications. So that all the work we're talking about through the course of this call about developing that sustainable circular economy in Europe and creating a model that is not only environmentally sustainable, but needs to be economically sustainable for it to have a longevity. That model is what we need to be able to deploy globally, so that instead of materials, when people have finished using them, being seen as being a waste and something to get rid of, is that they're seen as being potentially a feedstock of raw material that has value. If people see value in something, they will use it. They won't throw it away. And that's ultimately, I think, where we need to get to, is where materials at end of life, there's a value creation potential for them that they can be put back into life, either through a direct closed loop or through a mechanical recycling type application, or through a more extended loop through something like a chemical recycling process.
Excellent. Okay, well, we only have 2 minutes left, and so I'd love to hear just a sort of final comment, wrap up, priority, one thing that you want the audience to take away. And I'll come to you, Linnea, if that's okay first.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that all type of solutions to create more sustainable plastics is important. And then the second one is greenwashing. It's so important that the public believes and sees that these polymers are credible, that they are truly sustainable materials. And I believe that there maybe we've failed slightly. Some of the mass balance schemes are very difficult to explain to our customers. And the second one is the use of pre-consumer materials. I think that when people read that there's recycled content, that they always believe that it's post-consumer material. And within the car industry, we're heavy users of pre-consumer materials due to the tidiness and cleanliness of those streams, which means that we have the ability to use recycled materials. And I think those two areas we need to improve.
Excellent points. Thank you. And George?
Yeah, I think, I suppose my ask of the audience, keep scrutinizing, keep asking questions, keep pushing us further. Don't underestimate how much influence customer opinion can have on driving priorities of business.
Great point. Rob?
A couple of points. I think it's been mentioned actually by all of the contributors this afternoon, is that plastics can play a role in the transition. I think they are needed for that transition, but we need to be able to manufacture them in the right way, and we need to be able to treat with them in the right way at end of life. I think we need to recognize that is a transition. It's a massive transition for industry. It's a big transition for society. George touched on that earlier as well. And because it's such a big challenge, I think we need to recognize that every step on that route has a value. We won't be able to go from 0 to 100 in one step. It's just not feasible. It's not possible. It's not practical. But going from 0 to 30 might be a very credible and valuable and useful first step upon which we can then build to go to steps 60 to 80 to 100. So I think the focus on what we can do now, what difference can we make today and tomorrow, we shouldn't underestimate the value that has towards the transition. We know where we want to get to in 2050, but let's focus on what we need to do in 2023 as the way to get there. Let's start from today and work forwards, rather than start from tomorrow and work backwards.
And Stefano, last word to you.
Yeah, I can certainly agree with that, but we're already working. I mean, the colleagues that have been the other panelists, it's clear that, as I was saying at the beginning, is underway. And I think we can conclude, if you want, on an optimistic note. We can certainly envisage a future where plastics are made with net zero emissions, or maybe even negative emissions. A future where plastics manufacturing mainly relies on plastic waste, biomass, and even CO2, as we've heard, as feedstock, and the power with decarbonized electricity, and where whatever little plastic waste is still produced, systematically collected for recycling, and never ends up in the natural environment. To me, I mean, this looks not only like a desirable scenario, but also as an achievable scenario by 2050.
Excellent place to leave it. It leaves to me just to say thank you all very much. I feel like we only scratched the surface. There's so much more that we could talk about here, and I'm sure we will in future Inside Hours. But let me give my thanks to our sponsor, Plastics Europe, for making this discussion possible. My thanks to our speakers, Linnea, George, Rob, and Stefano. Of course, to you, our listeners and audience, and thank you for your questions. Until the next one, goodbye. Thanks again.